So what I want to do now is I want to pause. We've got time for questions and comments. Then I have one last thought to share with you about some other stories we may want to collect, a different kind of category. But let me leave it right now for any questions or comments about either the power of storytelling, how to tell a good story, or the kinds of stories we should collect. And do we have I see Haley has a microphone. Do we have another one? Or is that it? Right there in the blue.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. Years ago when I was doing some studying on narrative on my own, there's a book that you might be interested in called Narratives from the Crib by Catherine Nelson. And it's she's a psychologist who was actually studying her own little girl. And in a nutshell, her study was all about her own child. And her study really focused on the development of language in children. And this little girl told perfect narratives in the crib with the whole, your synopsis there.
Wow.
Anyway, it would, in my opinion, give you some more information to back up this is how our brain works.
Narratives from the Crib. Thank you very much for that.
Catherine Nelson.
If you can hand the microphone forward to this gentleman.
So I'm just wondering how you handle when there are stories out there that get in the way of the story that you're trying to tell.
Very good question.
So, for example, one of the, I don't know if this is a story, but it's a way to encapsulate it. If a student fails in K through 12, we blame the school. If a student fails in college, you blame the student. Or the student blames themselves, actually. I believe that narrative, that story, deeply affects how we look at how we fund higher education and all that. So how do you counteract that? How are you aware of those stories, or does it matter? I'm just curious.
That's an excellent question. I'm glad you made that point. When we tell stories, we don't do it in a vacuum. And if people have stories in their head about the way the world works that are contrary to what we're saying, they may very well reject what we say. I've got a story that works for me. We will not displace that story with facts, because stories act like filters. If you've got facts that don't agree with my story, I will reject your facts. I will say, that's not my experience. I don't think that's really the way the world works. The only thing that changes how people think is to displace that story with a more powerful story, and I'll give you an example. Again, outside your world, but relevant. In the battle against capital punishment, people who have opposed capital punishment for years were up against a very powerful story. And that story can be summed up in 4 words, 5 words. An eye for an eye. That's a biblical story. You kill somebody, you deserve to die. Simple as that. And so in state after state, as they fought capital punishment, saying it's immoral, an eye for an eye. That's from the Bible. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It's unconstitutional. An eye for an eye. That's from the Bible. States should not be involved in the act of killing people. Same thing. They could not displace that story. So for many, many decades, people fighting capital punishment couldn't move the dominant story until the early 1990s, when something came along called the Innocence Project. And the Innocence Project changed the story. What they said to people was not, let's argue about if capital punishment is right or wrong. They said, did you know that there are people on death row who are being executed who were later found to be innocent? We have executed innocent people. DNA evidence now exonerates people, and we are executing innocent people. So don't you think that we should either stop or slow the process of executions until we have a better handle on the evidence and a better sense of, are these people truly guilty? And when they ask the question, should we be executing innocent people or people where there's still a question, the vast majority of Americans will say, no, of course not. So that story of DNA evidence and exoneration became a powerful story, powerful enough, if not to displace, at least to move aside temporarily the eye for an eye story. And so I would contend to you, if we're talking about college productivity, we need those powerful stories that people will hear and nod and go, that is the way the world works. I do relate to that. I do feel something that will lodge in their heads and say, yes, this is the way we're going to improve education in this country. Changing minds is a matter of changing stories. And thank you very much for making that point. Other questions we have over there? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Andy. I'm Julie Bell with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I had a similar question. So since you've asked the question, it's sort of more a comment, I think. But I do want to build on that because I think that's a tremendously important point. certainly most of us here are dealing with policy and with policymakers. And policymakers are just individual people coming
Right.
from different places in life, and they've got their own stories. And so getting them past their anecdote or their notion or what they know as a parent or a grandparent or what they've experienced to get them to believe the bigger issues, the bigger trends, the bigger numbers is a challenge we really all face, and it's really what we're about in the work that we're doing here. So I guess I just wanted to add that as a piece of this. I don't know if you have a further comment or not, but I've definitely been thinking about that through your presentation.
No, I'm glad you said it. I would just add that I think the act of persuasion, of changing people's minds, it's a 1-2 punch. It starts with the story that gets the policymaker to look up from his BlackBerry for a second and to look you in the eye and to feel something. And it's then the second hand are the facts, are the evidence that say there is more than one story to be told here. Because I think it's not just storytelling alone is going to do it. The story is sort of the point of the spear that lets you get in there. But then the facts do the rest of the work. And the other way I'd put that is, we talk about the battle for hearts and minds. Well, there's a reason we say hearts and minds and not minds and hearts. If you don't capture their attention, if they don't care about it, you don't get to hear. So the value of the story is it gets people to look up from their notes, to look up from their BlackBerry, to look you in the eye and feel something, and then say, tell me more. Other questions we have? Right, did someone else have a microphone? Back there. Back there, and then we'll come to you, sir. Go to here. Well, you've got the microphone. Let's go there.
Well, actually, I'm sort of the third punch on the same line of
Okay.
reasoning, I think, as a former legislator for 17 years. I saw often the unintended consequences of people passing legislation based on only the stories. And
Right.
Often we have names. We can name a million pieces of legislation that came because someone had a very compelling personal story
Yeah.
to tell. So I thought this was very interesting, the last two questions, because what I didn't get with your original presentation was the hearts and minds part of the
Right.
discussion, which is the context and the reason why you're trying to get people to do that. Because often what would happen to me is I would have a very compelling story told to me with one side of the issue, and as soon as the door closed, I'd have someone would come in and tell me a very compelling story with a very different conclusion.
Right.
And my position would be, at the end of the day, I'm going to vote on something that I have to explain from more than just a story perspective.
Right.
So I really appreciate Julie's question and the question and the way that you framed this in a context and from an understanding that you have to undergird the story with a very good rationale.
Yes, absolutely. Good point. And part of the reason I'm motivated to do this work is I work with many nonprofits and foundations. Haley, can we get that microphone over here to this gentleman? Because he was next. You got one. Okay. I work with lots of nonprofits and people, and I watch them go into these rooms to testify or whatever, and they've got all their facts lined up, and then the other side tells one story and kicks their ass. And it just frustrates the hell out of me. And that's why I say to them, we've got to fight fire with fire. We need just as good stories. I'm not saying put away the data. I am not a data hater, okay? I'm with you on that. But have the story too. All right, sir.
Power of your presentation has to do with personalizing stories, and I think the point is exceptionally well made.
Thank you.
To the extent that this community has told a story, I think and I'm curious how you think of this. We've told it in terms of international competition. We've used the Chinese threat. We've looked at surveys that other nations are producing far more college graduates.
Yeah.
We've tied it to a sense of history, the components of your story,
Yeah.
that, the notion that America's always led the world. There's a sense of tradition, patriotism, so we touch the heart, and then we go to the head. But that's not the direction you've gone. You've gone with the individualized stories. What do you think of the globalized, sort of American patriotic story as a compelling way of doing this message, or would you think that that is not as effective as personalizing in the way that you described?
I think it works at certain levels, at people who think globally, people who think about systemic change. But if you're talking about building a movement, and I think ultimately we have to build a national movement for change where everyone rises up and says we need to do this, I think people are moved by stories. Average people, real people are moved by stories, and the notion of American heritage and stuff, it's nice. It's all nice, but it doesn't enter the sort of the category of necessary to them, I think. And I'll give you an analogy. I work with a lot of environmentalists working on global warming. I mean, there could be maybe no more important issue of our time in terms of the future of this planet and everybody living on it. But for the average American, no salience at all. They don't know anybody who died of global warming. They don't know anybody who's gotten sick by it. So it's down to the level of a story that I can tell to my neighborhood my neighbor, I think we have to have that component as well. I'm not delegitimizing what you're saying. I'm saying for a broader movement, and I really do believe we have to build a movement here, we must have those stories. Next question is back there.
Laura Bickelmeyer from Indiana. Speaking of stories, there's a wonderful book about first-generation college-going students named Limbo. Limbo. And it is fascinatingly full of stories that are, in some ways, very heart-wrenching stories. My question is about a phenomenon we have in the state of Indiana, and that is we have a number of people who still are going to be first-generation college-going students, should they go to college. And the premise in this book and the stories in this book are about mixed motivations for parents. And I think it's something in Indiana we really have to wrestle with, and I believe other states do as well. So you can tell the story, you can use the data that we had in the earlier presentation, you can turn those into stories, and you can say, our young people's quality of life will be better, our state will be better. But there's still the parent who says, I know I have to let go, potentially, of my child to do that. I know my child is going to go somewhere where I've never been before. My child, and that's intellectually, my child might move around the state, my child might not be here. So how do you compete, how do you address those competing stories? One, I want what's best for my child, but I know that I lose something. Because I really do think we have to figure out how to address that for the collective.
Well, I think you've answered your own question, which is you have to fight fire with fire. If there are these powerful stories out there that are counter to what we would say, we must come up with our own stories with real people and real examples that will move people, that they'll remember and repeat. You know, David was sort of joking earlier about the Kanye song and about him being a dropout. But, you know, Kanye is a dropout or Steve Jobs is a dropout. Those are extremely powerful stories. And we need to have stories just as powerful about the importance of completion and of carrying through. So that's the work we still have to do. I just think there's just no way around it. Was there another question? Right here, right there with the microphone.
I'm just now debating whether this is a good question or not. But
okay.
Statistically speaking, and I'm kidding about that part, but I'm just wondering, is there a generational difference in the impact of storytelling?
No.
I mean, are we seeing that being lost through the generation?
No.
That was a stupid question then. Thank you.
No, I'll tell you, storytelling is still central to the human experience, and I don't care how old you are, I don't care where you live, I don't care what language you speak. It is how human beings communicate. There is even some neuroscience research that shows that our brain has developed to actually look for elements of narrative to understand information coming at us. And that goes for babies, and that goes for old people, and that goes for kids who are, you know, twittering while they're Facebooking. You know, it's like, it's for everybody. So I see it as a universal. Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. Well, just to reinforce your point, and this was a little study that was done 2 decades ago, and I don't think it was a master's thesis. I don't think it was ever published, but a young man went around to a variety of states. It was mainly Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and southern states. And he asked legislators, tell me some stories about your colleges. Mm-hmm. And he categorized those stories and all that. And then he went back and looked at funding trends for higher education in those states.
Yep.
And it was really amazing, the connection. When the majority of the stories were things like in Georgia, well, Savannah State is working with the fishing industry to help them do this kind of thing. And Joe, I mean, it was a positive story about what was happening in that state. The correlation was really quite remarkable. When there was a preponderance of inefficiency, you know, arrogant stories. Right. Ohio was a good example because there was a young faculty member there who had been involved in a particular important policy issue in Ohio. And this is the story. So she's the protagonist. And she had been brought to the legislature. She had helped them craft legislation around, I think it was early childhood, helped them craft the legislation. They loved, you know, they told her story. And then the conclusion of the story was, and they went back after 3 or 4 years because they wanted to re-engage her around outcomes and things, and they discovered that Ohio State had denied her tenure. And that was a story he heard like 15 times in Ohio. Right. And, but anyway, the stories, I'm sure there are other factors, of course, but it was really interesting, the relationship between the quality of the nature of the stories, negative or positive, and really actual funding of higher education in those states. So it's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Good. Over there. With the microphone, yes.
Talk a little bit about the method of delivering the story.
Sure.
I noticed Twitter, short, long, images.
Yeah, how you deliver the story does depend on the medium. The web is not a reading medium, I find. So if you've got a nice 1,000-word story, save that for the annual report or the brochure or whatever. If it's going up on the web, I might put up the first paragraph and a link to download the PDF, or even better, give me the video version or the audio version. So just a short answer is that I like to think of stories as gold. First, go out and mine the gold in its raw form. You will then pound that gold into different shapes and sizes and lengths depending on where you do it. When you tell stories in person, I find most people, they'll give you about 2.5, 3 minutes. Unless you're, Ira Glass or Garrison Keillor or whatever. Generally about 2.5, 3 minutes, then the clock goes off and you better be done. When I take people through my workshops, I usually give them 750 words to write a good story, figuring that less is more. But on the web, generally, the less you write, the more you show, the better. But it's just a good general point that the story itself is gold. It takes different shapes depending on where you tell it, for sure. Good. Right in front, yes.
I'm with the mic.
There you are. You're live.
Melanie Wallach with the National Evaluation Team. We talk about, when you think about productivity, there are really isn't all that much evidence of stories with facts behind them. A lot of the stories of productivity are hunches of what we probably think will work. And so is there any advice for us in terms of different kinds of storytelling based on, we don't have a bunch of facts to support the story, but we think it's a good idea?
Well, I'm curious about that because, I read the 4 steps, and I see the various states with the success that they're starting to have, and even if that success is still anecdotal, it would strike me that there are stories within that, and when I showed a few illustrations, is that not what you're talking about?
Well, but you say exactly what you said. There's success, the success is anecdotal versus we don't have the kind of data that Teresa was saying she'd like to see as a policymaker, that's kind of serious evidence of success. The success is still kind of at the anecdotal stage.
Well, I think you start with what you have. If we've had successes, I would like to see the human stories that show me the people who are responsible, who were leading the way, and what they did and the problems they ran into and how they overcame them. And then you can show me the data of what the result was and where the arrow is pointing, and we're going to continue to collect. But let's get the stories while we have them, because we do have some success stories, and everyone in this room should know them. These stories should be traveling around here and be common currency, because they are the language of this movement. We need to speak that language, and it starts with those stories. So I know that there's some out there, at least to start. Over here? Okay.
Hi, I'm Helen Lowe, and I work with Lumina to help tell some of those stories that exist out there. And I want to just bring up, I think this might be where the broader context stories that Fred Duvall brought up before might be beneficial. Because if we can say what higher education was able to do in the past and what we were successful at, and then indicate that the successes we've had thus far, even though they're small, might be able to make higher education help us in the future. Those kinds of broad context stories, I think, help us position those smaller success stories. So we can say, look at all that we did in the past, here's some evidence of how we can change the future. And we can help people connect the dots in that way.
Yeah, I'd just say amen to that. Good. I see another hand over there, back here. Is there anybody else on this side? One more?
I might have a follow-up to that. A lot of the stories in this kind of context is about sometimes it works in this situation and sometimes it works in a different situation, or things have to be present in order for this to work. And so is there a good way of having stories that kind of say, you do it this way, it's going to work, but be careful, don't do it that way, because it might not work in that context.
Yeah, you can have the cautionary tale. So you've got the story that says, here's how you do it, and here's a story we tried that, it doesn't work, so never do that again. That's fine. There are all different kinds of stories that you should collect that will make points or caution people away from places potholes not to step in. Let me one more question, then I'm going to conclude. Go ahead.
Nasser Paydar from Indiana University East. There is a workshop tomorrow that I'll be part of that. I'm going to tell you stories about productivity. I hope you all come to that workshop.
Thank you. Since it doesn't compete with my workshop, that sounds good to me. All right, so closing thought. We've talked about the 4 categories of stories we need to collect for this very specific challenge, but I want to leave you with one more thought about kinds of stories. I keep pointing the wrong direction. I want to introduce you to this guy, Marshall Gans, whom some of you may know. Marshall Gans is currently a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government. He has an interesting story. Gans went to Harvard in, I think, 1961 to enroll as an undergraduate, but he saw what was happening in the South, and he decided to get involved with the Freedom Riders and be part of the civil rights movement. So he set up down south, and he was an organizer for civil rights for many years. From there, he went out west to work to be the right-hand man of Cesar Chavez and to work with the United Farm Workers in that movement. And he worked with them, and then he went for 20 years doing community organizing, political and religious organizing, until 1991 when he went back to Harvard to enroll as an undergraduate and then get his master's, and now he's lecturing in public policy. So when it comes to building a movement, this guy knows a thing or two. He's been on the ground. And Gans says that if you want to lead a movement, there are 3 stories you must tell. And I want to conclude with those 3 stories. The first is what he calls the story of self. It's a story that says, this is why I am called to this work. When you get up to talk about something and you want to lead, people want to know, well, what's your stake in this game? What drew you to this work? Why do you care so much? Who are you? So you have to be prepared to tell the story of self. And then right from that to the story of us. Sure, that's why I was called to this work, but why does it matter to you as well? Why is it important to you, your family, your neighborhood, your state, your country? What is the story of us? And then third is what he calls the story of now. Why we can no longer sit by the sidelines, why inaction is no longer an option. So as we collect these stories about the 4 steps, I would also say it's worth thinking about what is your story, what is the story of us, and what is the story of now. And if you look through American history, as movements have been built and the people who have led them, everywhere you look, it's people telling stories about themselves or about the people they work with, or they themselves are at the center of a story that becomes something that drives a movement. So I hope today that we will light the fire of storytelling and that it's time to tell our stories. Thanks very much for your time and attention.